Captain Sarah Chen floated in the pilot seat of the UES Defiant, her fingers dancing across the control panel with practiced ease. The small reconnaissance vessel hummed quietly through the void between star systems. Its stealth coating, making it nearly invisible against the cosmic backdrop. Sarah had been flying solo missions for the United Earth Coalition for 8 years, but nothing had prepared her for what her sensors were now detecting. The data streams flowing across her displays made her blood run cold. 1,700 Kytherian warships had gathered in the Proxima Drift, forming the largest military fleet ever assembled in known space. Each vessel was 3 times the size of Earth's largest battlecruiser, bristling with plasma cannons and quantum torpedoes that could crack a moon in half. Sarah's ship was alone, 30 light-years from the nearest human outpost. Her communication array had been damaged during a meteor shower 2 days earlier, leaving her unable to send long-range messages. The nearest coalition fleet was 48 hours away at maximum burn, and by then, the Galactic Armada would have already begun their assault on Earth's outer colonies. The Galactians were an ancient species that had ruled this galaxy long before humans had learned to make fire. They stood 12 feet tall, with crystalline skin that could deflect most energy weapons and 4 arms that moved with mechanical precision. Their technology was so advanced that human scientists could barely understand how their simplest devices worked. For 3 centuries, they had watched humanity's expansion with growing irritation, and now they had decided to end what they saw as an infestation. Sarah watched the tactical display as the massive fleet began to move. The Galactic ships arranged themselves in a perfect geometric formation, each vessel maintaining exact distances from its neighbors. Their movement was flawless, like watching a deadly dance performed by machines. At the center of the formation floated the command ship, a massive dreadnought that was larger than most human cities. The young pilot knew she should retreat immediately. The Defiant was designed for stealth and reconnaissance, not combat. Its single-pulse laser could barely scratch the paint on a Kytherian destroyer, let alone threaten their capital ships. Every instinct told her to run, to try to reach human space and warn them of what was coming. But Sarah Chen had never been one to follow instincts when lives were at stake. She studied the enemy formation carefully, her mind racing through possibilities. The Kytherians moved with absolute precision, but precision could become a weakness if someone understood how to exploit it. Their ships maintained perfect spacing, their course was completely predictable, and their commanders clearly believed no force in the galaxy could threaten them. They were wrong. Sarah began running calculations on her navigation computer, plotting trajectories and analyzing the gravitational fields in the system. The Proxima Drift was filled with asteroid clusters and gas clouds, remnants from an ancient stellar collision. Most pilots avoided the area because of its unpredictable gravitational anomalies, but Sarah had spent months mapping safe routes through the debris. She activated her ship's passive sensors and began a detailed scan of the Galactic fleet. Each warship had shields powerful enough to absorb the combined firepower of a human battle group, but shields required enormous amounts of energy. The bigger the ship, the more power it needed to maintain its defenses. And power systems, no matter how advanced, had limitations. The Defiant drifted closer to the enemy formation, staying hidden in the sensor shadow of a large asteroid. Sarah's hands moved steadily across her controls, her breathing slow and controlled, despite the adrenaline flooding her system. She had learned long ago that panic was a pilot's worst enemy. Clear thinking and careful planning were what separated the living from the dead in space combat. Through her ship's sensors, she watched the Galactic fleet adjust its formation slightly. The movement was minimal, perhaps 50 meters, but it told her everything she needed to know about their tactical doctrine. They were following a preset pattern, probably one that had been developed over thousands of years of warfare against inferior opponents. The Galactians had never faced an enemy that could match their technology, so they had never learned to adapt their strategies. Sarah smiled grimly as she began to formulate her plan. The Defiant might not be able to destroy even one Galactic ship in direct combat, but she didn't need to destroy them. She just needed to stop them. The human pilot activated her ship's manufacturing systems and began producing specialized equipment. The Defiant carried a small fabrication unit designed for emergency repairs. But with some creative programming, it could produce other things as well. Sarah started with simple proximity mines, devices no larger than her fist but packed with antimatter charges. They wouldn't be powerful enough to breach Catherian shields, but they didn't need to be. While the fabrication unit worked, Sarah plotted a complex course through the asteroid field. Her route would take the Defiant on a winding path between massive rocks and through dense gas clouds, staying hidden from the enemy sensors while positioning her ship for the next phase of her plan. It was dangerous flying, the kind that would challenge even the most experienced pilot. But Sarah had been threading needles in space since she was 16 years old. The Catherian fleet continued its steady advance toward human space, completely unaware that a single small ship was shadowing their movements. Their sensors were designed to detect major threats, not tiny reconnaissance vessels hiding in debris fields. The arrogance that had made them masters of the galaxy was now working against them. Sarah finished her course calculations and began the delicate process of moving through the asteroid field. The Defiant's engines produced almost no heat signature when running at minimum power, and its hull was coated with adaptive camouflage that matched the surrounding space. To the Catherians, she was invisible. The first part of her plan required getting close to the enemy fleet's supply ships. Every military force, no matter how advanced, needed fuel and ammunition to function. The Catherians were no exception. Their massive warships consumed enormous amounts of exotic matter to power their weapons and shields, and that fuel had to come from somewhere. Sarah identified 3 supply vessels at the rear of the formation, each one heavily laden with the materials needed to keep the fleet operational. They were protected by escorts, but their defensive screens were focused outward, watching for attacks from enemy fleets. Nobody expected a threat from a single tiny ship. The young pilot maneuvered the Defiant into position, using the gravitational pull of nearby asteroids to adjust her course without using her engines. It was a technique she had learned from an old smuggler during her training, a way to move through space without leaving any trace that sensors could detect. The process was slow and required incredible precision, but Sarah had patience. As she drifted closer to the supply ships, Sarah activated her fabrication unit's final products. In addition to the proximity mines, she had created a dozen specialized devices that looked like pieces of space debris. Each one contained a powerful transmitter and a small computer programmed with a very specific task. When activated, they would flood the local communication channels with false sensor readings, creating phantom ships and non-existent threats. The Defiant reached its first target position, drifting silently past a Catherian supply vessel. Sarah released her first set of devices, watching as they scattered into the asteroid field like seeds blown by an invisible wind. The transmitters would remain dormant until she activated them. But when that time came, they would create enough confusion to give her the opening she needed. She repeated the process twice more, positioning her false signals throughout the enemy formation. The Catherians continued their advance, completely unaware that their perfect formation was now compromised. Their sensors showed nothing but empty space and distant asteroids, exactly what they expected to see. Sarah piloted her ship to the final position, a small hiding spot behind a cluster of metallic asteroids that would mask her heat signature. From here, she could observe the entire enemy fleet and begin the most dangerous part of her plan. The Defiant's communication array might be damaged, but its local transmitters still worked perfectly. The human pilot took a deep breath and activated the first phase of her deception. Throughout the asteroid field, her hidden transmitters came to life, flooding Catherian sensors with false readings. Suddenly, their displays showed dozens of human ships emerging from behind asteroids, weapons powering up and moving to attack positions. The reaction was immediate. Catherian commanders, trained to respond to any threat with overwhelming force, began redirecting their ships to engage the Phantom fleet. The perfect formation started to break apart as individual vessels turned to face enemies that existed only in their computers. Sarah watched the chaos begin to unfold and prepared for the next phase of her plan. She had succeeded in getting the enemy's attention, But now came the really difficult part. She had to convince 1,700 of the most advanced warships in the galaxy that a single human pilot was a threat worth their full attention. The dance of deception had begun, and Sarah Chen was leading. The Catherian fleet erupted into controlled chaos as their sensors detected what appeared to be a massive human ambush. Warships that had maintained perfect formation for days suddenly broke ranks, turning to engage targets that existed only as electromagnetic phantoms. Sarah watched from her hiding spot as the enemy commanders struggled to understand how an entire battle fleet had appeared without warning. Admiral Thexvar stood in the command center of the dreadnought Eternal Dominion, his 4 crystalline arms moving rapidly across holographic displays. The massive Catherian had commanded fleets for over 2 centuries, and he had never encountered anything like this. His sensors showed 47 human vessels emerging from the asteroid field, each one broadcasting the energy signatures of heavily armed warships. "Impossible," Thexvar said, his voice echoing through the command center like grinding stone. "Our long-range scans detected no human forces in this system. Where did they come from?" His tactical officer, a younger Catherian named Zekthal, manipulated the sensor data with practiced efficiency. "The readings are consistent with cloaked vessels, Admiral. The humans must have developed new stealth technology." Sarah smiled as she listened to the intercepted Catherian communications. Their language was harsh and guttural, but her ship's translation software had no trouble converting it to English. The enemy commanders were doing exactly what she had hoped they would do, trying to understand an impossible situation using logical analysis. The human pilot activated the second phase of her deception. Her hidden transmitters began broadcasting targeting signals, making it appear as though the phantom human ships were preparing to fire. The response from the Catherian fleet was immediate and overwhelming. 1,700 warships opened fire simultaneously, sending waves of plasma bolts and quantum torpedoes into empty space. The asteroid field exploded in brilliant flashes of light as the enemy weapons struck rock and ice instead of enemy ships. Massive chunks of debris spun away from the impact sites, creating new obstacles and hiding spots. Sarah used the confusion to move the Defiant to a new position, staying hidden behind the cover of freshly created debris. But the real genius of her plan was just beginning to reveal itself. The Catherian weapons were incredibly powerful, but they required enormous amounts of energy to operate. Each salvo drained the ship's power reserves, forcing their commanders to choose between maintaining shields and continuing to fire. And because they were shooting at targets that didn't exist, they were wasting ammunition that would be impossible to replace this far from their home worlds. Admiral Thexvar realized the problem first. His ships had expended nearly 30% of their ammunition reserves, but the human fleet remained intact. Worse, the enemy ships seemed to be multiplying, with new contacts appearing on sensors even as old ones disappeared. "Cease fire," the Admiral commanded, his voice carrying the authority of absolute command. "All ships, maintain defensive positions and prepare for coordinated assault." Sarah knew she had bought herself some time, but the Catherians would not be fooled forever. Their scientists were already working to analyze the sensor readings, and eventually they would realize that something was wrong. She needed to escalate the deception before they figured out the truth. The human pilot activated her proximity mines, the small devices she had scattered throughout the enemy formation during her initial approach. They were not powerful enough to damage the Catherian ships, but they created spectacular explosions that registered on every sensor in the fleet. Suddenly, it appeared as though the human forces were launching a coordinated attack from multiple directions. The psychological effect was exactly what Sarah had hoped for. The Catherian commanders, faced with what appeared to be a simultaneous assault from dozens of directions, made the fatal mistake of trying to defend everything at once. Ships that had been arranged in perfect formation scattered across the asteroid field, each captain trying to protect his vessel from the nearest perceived threat. Zekthal studied the tactical display with growing confusion. "Admiral, the human attack patterns make no sense. They are striking at random intervals with no apparent strategy. Human tactics have always been chaotic," Thexvar replied. but Sarah could hear the uncertainty in his translated voice. They lack our discipline and coordination. But this level of disorganization is unusual, even for them. Sarah seized on that uncertainty and pushed her deception even further. She programmed her transmitters to create false communication chatter, broadcasting what sounded like panicked human voices, calling for reinforcements, and reporting impossible casualty figures. The translations were crude, but they painted a picture of a desperate human force fighting against overwhelming odds. The irony was not lost on her. In reality, she was the desperate one, fighting against impossible odds with nothing but clever tricks and stubborn determination. The Kytherian fleet continued to spread out, individual ships chasing phantom targets deeper into the asteroid field. Sarah watched as their perfect formation dissolved into scattered groups of vessels, each one operating independently. It was exactly what she needed for the final phase of her plan. The human pilot began moving the Defiant through the debris field with supernatural skill, using the gravitational effects of rotating asteroids to sling her ship between hiding spots without using her engines. Each movement was calculated to the smallest decimal, every course correction timed to coincide with the Kytherian's sensor sweeps. She was flying by instinct and mathematics, trusting her skills against technology that was centuries more advanced than anything humans had ever built. As she moved, Sarah continued to deploy her remaining equipment. Each new transmitter added to the chaos, creating additional phantom contacts that forced the enemy to spread their forces even thinner. She was fighting a battle of information, using the Kytherians' own superiority against them. The enemy ships were now scattered across hundreds of cubic kilometers of space, hunting targets that vanished the moment they approached. Their commanders were growing frustrated, their perfect coordination breaking down as individual captains made decisions without consulting the fleet command. Sarah saw her opportunity and took it. She maneuvered the Defiant toward one of the isolated Kytherian vessels, a heavy cruiser that had separated from its escorts while chasing a particularly convincing phantom signal. The ship was powerful enough to destroy her tiny reconnaissance vessel with a single shot. But its captain was focused on the false target ahead and not watching for threats from behind. The human pilot armed her ship's single-pulse laser and prepared for the most audacious part of her plan. She was not going to try to destroy the Kytherian cruiser, because that was impossible. Instead, she was going to do something that no Kytherian commander would ever expect from an enemy who was hopelessly outgunned. Sarah flew the Defiant directly at the cruiser's engine section, her finger poised over the firing control. At the last possible second, she fired a single pulse directly into the ship's exhaust port and then veered away, using the cruiser's own bulk to hide her escape route. The pulse laser bolt was tiny compared to the massive warship, but it struck at exactly the right moment. The cruiser's engines were cycling through their power sequence when the bolt hit, and the slight disruption caused a cascade failure in the ship's propulsion system. The vessel shuddered to a halt, dead in space and completely helpless. But the real brilliance of the attack was not the damage it caused, but the message it sent. Sarah had just demonstrated that the phantom human fleet could strike at will, crippling Kytherian vessels without warning. The psychological impact spread through the enemy fleet like wildfire as word of the disabled cruiser reached other ships. Admiral Thexvar studied the reports with growing alarm. The human force was not behaving like any enemy he had ever faced. They seemed to appear and disappear at will, striking when and where they chose with surgical precision. His ships were being picked apart one by one, and he could not even locate the main body of the enemy fleet. "How many ships do they have?" the admiral demanded. Zekthal worked frantically at his displays, trying to make sense of the contradictory sensor data. "The readings are inconsistent, Admiral. I am detecting between 40 and 90 vessels, but the numbers keep changing. That is impossible. No human force of that size could have reached this system without our knowledge." Sarah listened to the conversation and realized that she had pushed the deception as far as it could go. The Kytherians were starting to ask the right questions, and soon they would begin to find the right answers. She needed to end this quickly, before they discovered the truth about her phantom fleet. The human pilot began the most dangerous phase of her plan, She programmed her remaining transmitters to broadcast a final message, one that would either save the human colonies or get her killed in the next few minutes. The message went out on all Catherian communication frequencies, translated into their harsh language by her ship's computer. It was a challenge, pure and simple, broadcast in the name of the entire human species. "This is Admiral Sarah Chen of the United Earth Coalition," the message began, her voice steady and confident despite the impossible odds. "Your fleet has been surrounded and is cut off from retreat. Surrender now, and your lives will be spared. Continue this assault on human space, and we will destroy every ship in your armada." The silence that followed was deafening. For the first time in their recorded history, the Catherians had been threatened by a species they considered inferior. The psychological shock rippled through their fleet like a physical blow. Sarah waited in the darkness between asteroids, her hand steady on the controls, as 1,700 enemy warships tried to decide how to respond to an ultimatum from a single human pilot they didn't even know existed. The ultimatum hung in space, like a challenge to the very foundation of Catherian superiority. Admiral Thexvar stood motionless in his command center, his crystalline features reflecting the glow of tactical displays that showed his scattered fleet. Never in 300 years of military service had he faced a situation like this. "Admiral." Zekthal's voice was barely above a whisper. "How do we respond to such a demand?" Thexvar's forearms moved with unusual hesitation. The humans had demonstrated capabilities that defied everything the Catherians thought they knew about their technology. A fleet that could appear and disappear at will, strike without warning, and coordinate attacks from impossible angles, was not an enemy to be taken lightly. Sarah Chen floated in the pilot seat of the Defiant, watching the enemy fleet's reaction through her sensors. The Catherian ships had stopped moving, their commanders paralyzed by uncertainty. She had succeeded in creating doubt where there had once been absolute confidence. But she knew the deception could not last much longer. The human pilot activated her final set of transmitters, the ones she had saved for this crucial moment. These devices were different from the others, programmed to create the most convincing illusion yet. Across the asteroid field, massive energy signatures began to appear, each one matching the profile of a human dreadnought, powering up its main weapons. The effect on the Catherian fleet was immediate. Ships that had been drifting in confusion suddenly began moving again, but not toward human space. They were pulling back, trying to regroup in the face of what appeared to be an overwhelming enemy force preparing for a devastating attack. "Admiral," Zekthal reported, his voice tight with barely controlled panic, "I am detecting 12 human capital ships charging their primary weapons. Energy readings are off the scale." Thexvar studied the displays with growing unease. The tactical situation had deteriorated beyond anything in his experience. His fleet was scattered, low on ammunition, and apparently surrounded by an enemy force of unknown size. Every principle of military doctrine demanded that he withdraw and reassess the situation. But retreat was not a word in the Catherian vocabulary. For 3 millennia, their fleets had never withdrawn from battle. They were the masters of this galaxy, the ultimate expression of technological superiority. To flee from a human force would be an admission of weakness that would echo throughout their empire. Sarah sensed the moment of decision approaching and made her choice. She programmed her ship's transmitters to broadcast one final message. But this one was different. Instead of threats or ultimatums, she transmitted something that no Catherian had ever heard from a human before. "Admiral Thexvar." Sarah's voice cut through the communication channels, addressing the enemy commander directly. "I know you can hear me. Unhavlime. 18 SIGs. Unhavlime. Unhavlime. Admiral Thexvar. I know you are trying to decide whether to fight or retreat. But before you make that choice, I want you to understand something about humanity that your databases do not contain." The Catherian admiral's 4 hands froze over his controls. Somehow, The human knew his name and rank, information that should have been impossible to obtain. More disturbing was the tone of the message, not the desperate bluster he expected from a cornered enemy, but the calm confidence of someone who held all the advantages. "You believe humans are inferior because our technology is primitive compared to yours?" Sarah continued, her voice steady and clear. "You measure strength by the power of weapons and the thickness of armor. But you have never understood what makes humans truly dangerous." Sarah paused, letting the words sink in before continuing. "We do not fight because we are strong. We fight because we refuse to surrender. We do not win because we have better weapons. We win because we never stop trying to find a way, no matter how impossible the odds." The human pilot maneuvered the Defiant closer to the Catherian command ship, staying hidden in the sensor shadow of a massive asteroid. She was now less than 10 kilometers from the most heavily armed vessel in the enemy fleet, close enough that a single mistake would mean instant death. "Your fleet is the most powerful force ever assembled," Sarah said, her voice carrying across space to reach every Catherian ship. "Your ships are technological marvels that my people could not duplicate in 1,000 years. Your weapons could crack planets. Your shields could withstand the fury of stars." Admiral Thexvar found himself listening despite his better judgment. There was something in the human's voice that demanded attention, a quality he had never encountered in any of the species his empire had conquered. "But all of that power means nothing," Sarah continued, "because you have forgotten the most important lesson of warfare. Technology does not win battles. Will does. And human will is something your computers cannot calculate, or your weapons cannot destroy." The moment had come for the final gambit. Sarah activated every transmitter simultaneously, creating the illusion of a massive human fleet, decloaking all around the scattered Catherian forces. To their sensors, it appeared as though hundreds of warships had suddenly materialized from nothing, surrounding them completely. But instead of opening fire, the Phantom fleet simply waited. Weapons powered, but not firing. The message was clear: surrender, or face annihilation. The psychological pressure was unbearable. Catherian commanders who had never known defeat found themselves facing an enemy that defied all logic and prediction. Their perfect formations had been shattered, their superior firepower rendered useless by an opponent who fought with tactics they could not understand. Admiral Thexvar made the most difficult decision of his career. "All ships," he transmitted to his scattered fleet, "prepare for tactical withdrawal. We will regroup and return with additional forces." Sarah almost could not believe what she was hearing. The most powerful military force in the galaxy was retreating. Not because they had been defeated in battle, but because a single human pilot had convinced them that they could not win. But the game was not over yet. Sarah knew that once the Catherians returned to their home worlds and analyzed what had happened, they would discover the deception. When they came back, they would be prepared for human trickery. "Admiral," Sarah's voice stopped the Catherian fleet in the middle of their withdrawal. "There is one more thing you need to know." Thexvar hesitated, his ship already turning away from the asteroid field. "What is it, human?" "My name is Captain Sarah Chen, and I am alone." The words hit the Catherian fleet like a physical blow. 1,700 warships, the pride of an ancient empire, had been outmaneuvered and forced to retreat by a single human pilot in a tiny reconnaissance vessel. Sarah continued, her voice carrying a mixture of pride and exhaustion. "There is no human fleet hiding in these asteroids. There are no cloaked battleships waiting to attack. There is just me, one pilot in one small ship, armed with nothing but determination and a refusal to let my people down." The silence that followed was absolute. Every Catherian in the fleet was trying to process the impossible truth. They had been defeated not by superior technology or overwhelming firepower, but by the sheer audacity of a single human who had refused to accept that the situation was hopeless. Admiral Thexvar felt something he had never experienced before: respect for an enemy. The human had not used advanced weapons or secret technology. She had used intelligence, creativity, and an unshakable belief that there was always a way to win. "How?" was all the Admiral could manage to say. Sarah smiled, though no one could see it. Because I am human, Admiral. And humans do not surrender. The young pilot began transmitting the complete technical specifications of her deception, showing the Catherians exactly how she had created the illusion of a massive fleet, using nothing but simple transmitters and creative programming. She wanted them to understand that it was not magic or advanced technology that had defeated them, but the one thing they could never replicate: human ingenuity. As the data streamed across their communication channels, the Catherians began to understand the full scope of what had happened. They had been outfought not by superior technology, but by a mind that refused to accept limitations. Sarah Chen had turned their own strengths against them, using their reliance on sensor data and logical analysis to create a victory where none should have been possible. Admiral Thexvar studied the technical details with something approaching awe. The deception was brilliant in its simplicity, elegant in its execution, and devastating in its effectiveness. No Catherian commander would have thought to attempt such a strategy, because it required a willingness to risk everything on a plan that should have been impossible to execute. Captain Chen, the Admiral transmitted, his voice carrying a respect that had been earned through combat. What do you want from us? Sarah had been waiting for that question. I want you to go home, Admiral. I want you to explain that humans are not the primitive savages you thought we were. We are a species that will never stop fighting for our freedom, no matter how hopeless the odds. She paused, considering her next words carefully. And I want you to remember that this is what happens when you underestimate the power of human will. The Catherian fleet began its long journey home, leaving the asteroid field behind. But they carried with them something more valuable than any victory: knowledge. They had learned that true strength came not from technology or firepower, but from the refusal to surrender in the face of impossible odds. Sarah Chen watched the enemy ships disappear into hyperspace, their massive forms dwindling to points of light before vanishing completely. She had done the impossible, defeated an entire armada with nothing but clever tricks and unshakable determination. The Defiant drifted alone in the asteroid field, its pilot exhausted but victorious. Sarah began the long journey back to human space, carrying news that would change everything. The Catherians could be beaten, not through superior technology, but through the one thing that made humans truly unique: the absolute refusal to give up. Years later, when historians wrote about the Battle of Proxima Drift, they would struggle to explain how a single pilot had defeated the largest fleet in galactic history. The technical details were all there, carefully documented in Sarah's own reports, but the true secret of her victory could not be quantified or replicated. It lived in the human spirit itself, in the stubborn belief that there was always a way to win, no matter how impossible the situation seemed. The Catherians had superior technology, but humans had something better. They had will. And as Admiral Thexvar would report to his superiors upon his return, human will was the most dangerous weapon in the galaxy.